March 10, 1944, Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. The air was sharp with the chill of late winter, and the sky hung low and gray over the sprawling compound of fences and barracks. From the decks of U.S. transport ships, rows of Japanese women stepped hesitantly onto American soil. They were nurses, clerks, and civilian auxiliaries, the overlooked shadows of an empire now unraveling. Each carried not only a bundle of belongings, but also the crushing weight of fear. In Tokyo, propaganda had prepared them for nightmares. Leaflets and radio broadcasts had warned that American soldiers were brutes, that capture meant dishonor, humiliation, and perhaps even death. To be taken alive was portrayed as worse than dying for the emperor. Now, as boots touched the ground, every eye darted in suspicion, expecting jeers, blows, or worse. Instead, silence greeted them, the disciplined stillness of uniformed guards, their rifles slung but not raised. The march began. The women were herded past barbed wire, its cold steel glinting faintly in the weak sun. Inside the gates, an orderly scene awaited. Rows of barracks aligned with military precision, flags snapping in the wind, medical officers standing by. It was not the chaos of brutality, but the unsettling calm of order. For captives conditioned to expect violence, order itself felt like an ambush. Soon came the first shock. The prisoners were directed towards steaming barrels and wooden tables stacked with small white bars. So, American soldiers handed it to them, firm in their instructions, gesturing toward the lousing stations. Panic rippled through the women. Whispers filled the air, urgent and trembling. "Is this the poison they warned us of?" One voice quivered. Another muttered, "They want to finish us before we enter." The scent of lies stung their noses. Some recoiled, clutching the soap as if it might burn. In their minds, every action confirmed the warnings drilled into them. Yet nothing happened. No poison, no cruelty, only water, steam, and a forward demand for cleanliness. It was here, in this moment of confusion, that the paradox of their captivity took root. The barracks loomed ahead, wooden and plain but swept clean. Straw mattresses, folded blankets, and orderly rows of cots defied the images they had carried across the Pacific. They were inspected, their health noted, their names entered into ledgers according to Geneva Convention protocols. For women who had braced for humiliation, the antiseptic formality of medical officers felt even more disorienting. One prisoner later wrote in her diary, "The enemy gave us soap. I feared death, but instead they gave me cleanliness. I could not understand which fate was worse." Day faded into night. Guards paced the wire with measured steps, boots thudding softly in the damp earth. Inside the barracks, whispers lingered long after lights out. Some prayed to the emperor. Others clutched trinkets or family photos. Yet all were haunted by the same contradiction. Their enemy had not struck them down, but treated them with a kind of cold civility. The soap, that small white bar, lay by their bunks, a silent witness. To some, it remained a weapon in disguise, waiting for its true purpose. To others, it became a strange token of survival, but none could deny the unease it carried. Kindness unsettled them more than cruelty would have. The night closed in around Fort Oglethorpe, its fences humming faintly in the wind. Behind the wire, the women's fear had not vanished, only changed. What they had found was not the help promised by propaganda, but something stranger, harder to grasp. If captivity began with soap, what would tomorrow bring? The barracks at Fort Oglethorpe settled into silence, but the minds of the women remained restless. In their imaginations, shadows of propaganda clashed with the scenes they had witnessed that day. Back in Japan, leaflets, broadcasts, and training lectures had hammered home a single chilling message. Surrender to the Americans meant dishonor, abuse, and almost certain death. The women had been told that American soldiers were beasts in uniform, devoid of mercy. They had been warned that captivity would strip them of their dignity, their humanity, and their place as loyal subjects of the emperor. Propaganda was a weapon as sharp as any bayonet. Tokyo's Ministry of Information produced pamphlets that described camps filled with disease and degradation. Radios blared warnings that American soldiers viewed Japanese women as little more than spoils of war. Military training manuals, issued even auxiliaries, drilled the idea that capture was the ultimate shame. Mothers told daughters it was better to leap from cliffs than to endure the enemy's grasp. These words had shaped the women's nightmares during the voyage across the Pacific. Now reality pushed against those dark images. The camps in America, though enclosed by barbed wire, were governed not by cruelty, but by the Geneva Convention. Inspections were conducted by Red Cross officials, who moved freely through the facilities. The U.S. Army ran the sites with rigid discipline, documenting rations, medical checks, and even the condition of bedding. The War Shipping Administration, which had transported the prisoners across the ocean, recorded the logistics of each arrival, ensuring that procedures matched international agreements. This was not the chaos of conquest, but the order of bureaucracy. Still, the women could not reconcile the two worlds. When they entered their new quarters, they saw piles of neatly stacked soap on wooden shelves, placed alongside folded towels and clean basins. The sight was unsettling. Whispers darted through the room like sparks. "It must be a trick," one voice said. "They want us to trust them first," another muttered. For captives raised on fear, kindness looked like deception. The soap, meant as a gesture of hygiene, felt more ominous than reassuring. Every detail, the scheduled meals, the orderly roll calls, the written records, deepened the paradox. The enemy was not behaving as the stories had promised. The first full day in the camp passed in a haze of inspection and orientation. The women lined up for medical checks, where American officers spoke through translators, recording their conditions with clinical detachment. Rations were issued according to protocol: bread, beans, coffee, and occasionally meat. It was plain, but it was more than many remembered seeing in the last years of Japan's war effort. Hunger at home had been fierce, yet here in captivity, food appeared with unsettling regularity. Some women tried to capture their confusion in secret notes or diary entries, scribbled hastily on scraps of paper. One fragment, later recalled, read, "If these are barbarians, why do they feed us? If this is hell, why does it look so clean?" Such thoughts were dangerous, for they clashed with years of indoctrination. To admit the enemy's order and restraint was to admit that the empire's words might have been lies. Night fell, and the camp quieted under the rhythm of boots on gravel as guards made their rounds. Behind the barrack walls, the prisoners lay awake, staring at the beams above their bunks. Some whispered prayers for Japan's victory, clinging to loyalty as if it were a shield. Others said nothing, their minds occupied by the contradiction that captivity had not yet matched the horrors they had been promised. The day ended as the first had begun, with uncertainty. Outside the wire, the world still raged in fire and ruin. Inside, order ruled. But order was its own kind of disorientation. For women who had been taught that the enemy's hand held only cruelty, the calm discipline of the camp was perhaps the most unsettling weapon of all. And so the question lingered, unspoken but heavy in the air. If the first full day behind American wire felt like this, what would the first night bring? The dawn whistle cut through the stillness of the camp, sharp and mechanical. It was the same each morning. The women filed into the yard for roll call, their breath visible in the cool air, their bodies stiff from wooden bunks. American officers stood with clipboards, counting, recording, ensuring order. The sound of boots on gravel, the crack of commands through interpreters, and the steady hum of discipline marked the beginning of every day. After roll call, life fell into routine. Some were assigned to laundry duty, scrubbing uniforms in long troughs, where water mixed with soap into a cloudy froth. Others cleaned barracks or helped prepare rations in the mess hall. The diet was plain but steady: bread, beans, coffee, and sometimes meat. Compared to the rice shortages and hunger stalking wartime Japan, the food felt unsettling in its abundance. Even more shocking were the Red Cross parcels, delivered at intervals, containing small luxuries: canned milk, sugar, and once in a great while, chocolate. For many, bread became a symbol of survival. Its steady appearance on their tin plates seemed to defy the chaos of the outside world. Some ate quickly, suspicious that the generosity carried hidden motives. Others lingered, savoring each bite, quietly admitting that in captivity, they ate better than in freedom. One young nurse whispered over a crust, "What kind of prison feeds you more than your homeland?" The question hung in the air, too dangerous to answer. Women scribbled quietly by the light of a single bulb, recording the paradox in secret. One entry later recalled, "Each day, we line up like soldiers. We are counted like cattle, but then given bread and soap. How can captivity taste sweeter than loyalty?" These words captured the tension between gratitude and shame. The soap, once feared as poison during delousing, became a part of daily life. Women scrubbed their hands, their uniforms, even their hair with it. Cleanliness became routine, and with it came unease. To be clean was to participate in an order designed by the enemy. Some accepted it as a necessity. Others resented it as a slow erosion of identity. The guards, always watchful, walked the perimeter and checked the barracks. Their presence reminded the women that, no matter the abundance, freedom was gone. Yet the discipline was not cruelty. Inspections ensured that bedding remained dry, that food supplies were accounted for, that sanitation was maintained. It was captivity governed by regulations, not rage. Small moments of dialogue revealed the fractures among the women. "They are fattening us for something worse," one insisted, refusing to eat her bread. "Better to live on their food than to die of hunger for honor," another replied quietly, avoiding the stares of her companions. The contradictions piled higher with each passing day. Some found strength in routine, their health improving after months of scarcity. Others resisted, clinging to imperial songs hummed at night, the faint melodies of loyalty drifting through the barracks after lights out. To accept the camp's stability felt like betrayal. To reject it risked collapse. The abundance was undeniable. Meals arrived on time. Soap rested on shelves. Bread filled bellies. Once, a Red Cross package contained a single bar of chocolate. Women divided it into slivers, passing it hand to hand, each piece melting slowly on their tongues. For some, it was a reminder of dignity, of life continuing. For others, it was humiliation, proof that the enemy gave them sweetness their own country could not provide. And so life under watchful eyes became a paradox, both prison and sanctuary. Barbed wire confined them, but inside that wire, order ruled. Fear had not vanished, but it had shifted. The enemy's kindness was more disarming than cruelty ever could be. As the women lay down at night, listening to the faint murmur of guards patrolling outside, one thought returned again and again. If captivity looked like this, then the true battlefield was no longer physical. It was psychological. Tomorrow, the war inside their minds would begin. The barbed wire no longer shocked them. The routines of camp life, roll call, meals, inspections, had become a rhythm they could not escape. Yet beneath that rhythm, a deeper conflict stirred, a war without weapons. It was fought not in the fields or barracks, but within their minds. For months, Tokyo's warnings had echoed in their memories. The enemy is barbaric. Capture is worse than death. Yet each day in Fort Oglethorpe chipped away at that certainty. Guards walked their rounds with calm faces, offering nods rather than blows. Medical officers treated fevers and infections with efficiency, handing out aspirin and bandages. To some women, these gestures of care began to erode the hard edge of propaganda. To others, they were nothing but traps. Kindness as a weapon designed to strip them of loyalty. Soap, once feared as poison, had become part of their daily lives. It lathered in buckets, foamed on skin, filled the barracks with a faint, sharp scent. Clean hands and clean clothes gave a strange sense of dignity, yet also shame. One diary entry read, "To be clean is to forget who we are." Dirt was proof of struggle. Now we shine like them. For some, every stroke of soap felt like betrayal, as though washing themselves meant scrubbing away their identity. Moments of humanity from the guards only deepened the turmoil. On warm afternoons, women saw soldiers lean against fences, laughing over cigarettes, passing a canteen of coffee. They were not monsters, not the brutes described in pamphlets. They were young men, many no older than the prisoners themselves. A clerk whispered to her bunkmate, "If they treat us like this, who is the true barbarian?" Her words sparked silence, a silence born of fear, because the question was too dangerous to voice again. Small exchanges revealed the fractures within the group. They are softening you," one woman accused, turning away from her comrade. "They are human, just as we are," came the hesitant reply. The clash was not physical, but it cut deep. The paradox grew more painful as time passed. Health improved inside the wire. Some women gained weight after years of scarcity. Faces filled out, skin healed from malnutrition. For those who had left behind starving families, the improvement was unbearable. Survival here felt like treason. Each Red Cross parcel, each slice of bread, each bar of soap became a reminder. They lived well while their homeland starved. The camp rules reinforced this tension. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were not to be humiliated. They were given regulated rations, access to medical care, and the right to send censored letters home. These protections, designed to uphold dignity, collided violently with the propaganda they had believed. The contradiction gnawed at their loyalty. Their enemy followed laws their own leaders had dismissed. Some resisted quietly. They saved bread crusts, hiding them away until they spoiled, proof that they had not been conquered by food. Others turned to song at night, their whispers weaving fragments of patriotic hymns, thin voices rising like smoke in the dark. Still, there were those who adapted, grateful for warmth, food, and order. Survival became their quiet act of rebellion against a war that demanded their death. The psychological battlefield was merciless. Every act of kindness became a weapon, every routine a challenge to their convictions. Captivity no longer meant only barbed wire and watchtowers. It meant wrestling with questions that had no safe answers. Then, a rumor began to circulate. It spread from barrack to barrack, whispered cautiously at laundry lines and during roll call. Repatriation, the possibility of being sent home. Some hearts leapt with hope. Others sank with dread. For they returned, how would they explain the truth? Could they admit that captivity had not broken them with cruelty, but unsettled them with mercy? The chapter closed on that uncertainty. For these women, the greatest fear was no longer death or punishment. It was a question of identity and what fragments of loyalty would remain if freedom came. By the spring of 1945, the women at Fort Oglethorpe had lived within the rhythm of captivity long enough that the barbed wire no longer shocked them. For some, the camp had become a strange refuge from the chaos of a homeland racked by fire bombings and famine. For others, every ration, every orderly roll call was a reminder of their defeat, a humiliation to endure. Routines pressed on with military precision. At dawn, a whistle cut the air, summoning prisoners into formation for roll call. Breakfast followed, bread, beans, and coffee served from steaming pots in the mess hall. To women who had once scraped for scraps back in Japan, this abundance was unsettling. Diaries captured the paradox. One entry read, "Here, I eat more than my family at home. Each bite is heavy with guilt." Bread and soap, once mere objects, had become symbols. Survival for some, dependence for others. Not all accepted this quiet abundance. Resistance appeared in subtle acts. Some women refused to finish their rations, pushing food away as if rejecting it would prove their loyalty. A few, in whispered solidarity, sang fragments of imperial songs at night, their thin voices threading to the barracks like ghosts. Others discarded bread in secret, letting it rot beneath the wooden floors, a silent protest against nourishment offered by the enemy. Yet in the same barracks, another group of women wrote by lamplight, scribbling into diaries that living, simply surviving, was its own form of rebellion against a war that demanded their death. Tensions grew within these walls. Conversations turned sharp. "It is better to be alive here than dead there," one woman muttered over a cup of coffee. Her bunkmate answered with disdain, "Better to die with honor than live on their bread." Such words split the room, forging invisible lines between those who adapted and those who resisted. The Americans enforced Geneva Convention rules with formality. Inspections by the International Red Cross recorded that the camp provided proper rations, medical treatment, and monitored working assignments. Prisoners were spared heavy labor, instead tasked with laundry, gardening, or clerical duties. These jobs gave structure, but also fed suspicion. Was this order kindness or control? Even small items carried the weight of meaning. Soap remained a daily constant. To some, Its sharp scent meant dignity restored. To others, each lather washed away a piece of their identity, as if the enemy's cleanliness seeped into their skin. Bread carried the same paradox, nourishment for the body, but shame for the soul. Chocolate, occasionally distributed from Red Cross parcels, was almost unbearable in its sweetness, a taste that mocked their homeland's hunger. The quiet revolts never grew into open defiance. There were no uprisings, no mass refusals. The barbed wire and armed towers ensured control. Yet within the minds of the prisoners, the battle raged with intensity. One woman scribbled in her diary, "I do not bow to them, but I eat their bread," which is greater the act of the thought. It was in the psychological battlefield that turning points emerged. Some prisoners allowed themselves to smile at a guard's awkward joke. Others clasped the bread ration tightly, accepting that survival was not dishonor but endurance. Meanwhile, the resistors held on, whispering songs and discarding food, their defiance invisible but fierce. The paradox fractured the camp's unity. No longer were they simply Japanese women imprisoned in America. They were divided within, each negotiating captivity in her own way. The quiet revolts, whether discarding food or daring to live, revealed that captivity reshaped loyalty in unpredictable ways. Then, whispers began to ripple through the camp. Letters censored but not silenced hinted that the tide of war was shifting. Japan's defeats multiplied, and talk of eventual release spread from bunk to bunk. The news stirred both relief and dread. To return home alive was hope, yet to return with stories of abundant bread and soap, of surviving in comfort while families starved. This was a fate some feared more than captivity itself. The chapter closed with that haunting uncertainty. The women stood between two worlds, caught in the paradox of captivity, waiting to learn if freedom would restore them or destroy them. By the summer of 1945, the end of the war was near, and whispers of repatriation spread through the camp like a tide that could not be held back. For the women at Fort Oglethorpe, the word return carried a weight heavier than the barbed wire that had confined them. The barracks that once felt like cages now seemed paradoxically safe compared to the firebombed cities and starving families they had left behind. Preparations began quietly. Lists were drawn, names checked, and personal belongings, diaries, folded clothes, a bar of soap tucked in a bag, were gathered for the journey home. The soap, once mistaken for poison, had become part of their daily rhythm, a scent that marked survival. Bread and even the rare taste of chocolate, received through Red Cross parcels, now seemed tokens of life they had never expected in captivity. To leave them behind felt almost like abandoning a strange security. The exchange program that would return them home had been carefully negotiated. Ships like the Gripsholm, flying the neutral Swedish flag, had already ferried prisoners and civilians across oceans in delicate swaps between warring nations. Now, these women would take their place in history's quiet procession of repatriates. Figures moved across the chessboard of diplomacy. The departure scene carried a heavy silence. Guards stood at attention, saluting the prisoners they had watched over for years. In turn, the women bowed, awkwardly, hesitantly, gestures of respect shaped by cultures that had called each other enemies. For many, it was the first time they looked at their captors not as monsters, nor entirely as protectors, but as men who had simply followed their own orders, as they themselves had. Tears blurred the moment. Some women clutched diaries to their chests, their pages filled with the paradoxes of captivity. Entries of fear, relief, and shame intertwined. One line read, "How do I explain that here, in the enemy's camp, I was fed and kept alive while my people starved?" Others carried small tokens, a bar of soap, a folded blanket, a piece of chocolate wrapper tucked between pages, as if proof of the contradictions they had endured. Yet beneath the solemn ceremony lay a gnawing dread. What would await them in Japan? One whispered the fear aloud. What would they say when they learned we lived in comfort? The words rippled through the group, unspoken anxieties brought to the surface. Survival itself had become a dangerous burden. For in their homeland, stories of American camps as places of order and dignity would clash against years of propaganda and national suffering. Some of the women left healthier than when they arrived, nourished by rations and medical care absent in Japan's crumbling infrastructure. This fact unsettled them most of all. To have endured captivity and emerged stronger was, in its own way, a shame too heavy to confess. Their health, their survival, their very breath, all bore the mark of the enemy's hand. As the buses carried them from Fort Oglethorpe to the ports, the landscape of America rolled by one last time. Wide roads, green fields, towns untouched by war. For years they had lived inside the paradox of a prison that provided safety. Now, the wire and watchtowers faded behind them, and the ocean ahead promised not just freedom, but judgment. The war was ending, but the true battle was only beginning. Repatriation would return them to families and to a nation scarred by defeat. Yet they carried back something more troubling than hunger or loss: the memory of a captivity that had contradicted everything they had been told. Soap, chocolate, and bread would never again be ordinary things. They were emblems of survival and of shame. As the ships prepared to sail, the women stood at the rails, gazes fixed on the horizon. America faded behind them. Japan waited ahead. Between the two shores lay an invisible battlefield, one not of guns and bombs, but of memory, identity, and truth. And so the chapter closed with a haunting paradox. Captivity had preserved their lives, but freedom might yet condemn them. The war was over. The women had returned home, yet the shadows of captivity followed them across the sea. For years, their experiences lingered unspoken, too complex to fit into the narratives of victory or defeat that dominated the post-war world. But in private testimonies, scattered across diaries and whispered recollections, one phrase recurred with unsettling clarity. The American camps had been, in their words, a paradise on earth. It was not paradise in the sense of luxury. There were no feasts, no silks, no freedoms. What the women meant was something far more haunting. For the first time in years, they had lived with order, with regular meals, with access to soap, bread, and even the occasional piece of chocolate. These simple things had restored dignity in a time when survival itself seemed impossible. And yet, gratitude was always bound with shame. To admit that life under the enemy's guard had provided comfort was to betray everything they had been taught to believe. One former auxiliary wrote years later, "How could I say aloud that behind the wire I ate better than my mother in Tokyo? How could I confess that the enemy's order preserved my life, while my nation crumbled?" Her words, like many others, reveal the paradox of the heart of captivity, that kindness from the enemy could wound as deeply as cruelty. Once feared as poison, it had become a symbol of survival, of enforced cleanliness, of life continuing when death had been expected. But it also became a marker of complicity. Some women confessed that every bar they accepted felt like a quiet surrender, a softening of loyalty. Others saw it differently. To wash, to survive, to write in diaries by the dim light of camp lamps was itself a rebellion against war's attempt to erase them. In Japan, few wanted to hear these truths. Returning prisoners were often treated with suspicion, their survival questioned, their loyalty doubted. Stories of relative comfort behind American wire clashed against the agony of a homeland gutted by bombings and famine. And so, many women chose silence. Their diaries remained hidden, their testimonies confined to archives, their paradox carried like an invisible scar. But history does not remain silent forever. In later decades, researchers uncovered their words, piecing together a narrative that unsettled both victors and vanquished. American officers had followed the Geneva Convention. Red Cross inspections had enforced standards. And in many cases, women left the camps healthier than when they had entered. These facts challenged the easy lines of propaganda, revealing a truth that was both humane and cruel in its implications. For the women themselves, the memory was less about statistics than about sensations. The taste of bread that did not run out, the smell of soap in the washhouse, the sound of guards laughing like ordinary men. These fragments stitched together a paradox too heavy to resolve. Was it paradise? Was it prison? It was both, and it was neither. The final image returns to where it began. In the silence of early dawn, the barracks stood empty, shadows stretching long across the wooden floors. On a shelf by the washstand sat a single bar of soap, pale in the half-light, a relic of fear transformed into survival. Steam drifted upward from the pipes, vanishing into the quiet. In that image lay the legacy of their captivity, a reminder that war's deepest contradictions do not live only in bloodshed, but in unexpected mercy. The enemy's kindness had preserved their lives, but it left wounds no less enduring than cruelty. And so their story ends where it began, with soap, with silence, and with the haunting truth that captivity could be both paradise and prison.